Welcome to the place of rest, where our aim is to give you language that helps you displace the growing confusion, chaos, and dis-ease of our times. My name is Jonathan Boyce, and it's my pleasure to bring to you today's episode. Virginia sits down with psychotherapist Jerry Marzinsky to talk about his groundbreaking discovery while working in mental health. We hope you enjoy today's conversation.
Jerry, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I am going to jump right into this fascinating conversation that I'm looking forward to having with you about your line of work, your research, your discoveries. After listening to numerous podcasts that you recorded, I am persuaded that not only are you spot on in dealing with issues of mental health, but you have the credibility, background, and experience to speak to a very complicated state of affairs that we find ourselves in pertaining to mental health and what seems to be a world gone mad. This said, you're nodding your head.
Absolutely.
In fact, I see the exact opposite. I think things are finally coming to the surface and we can have honest conversations of what's happening right to us and around us.
Yep, they got to come up before you can do anything about them.
Tell our listening audience firsthand a little bit about your background, and then tell us what caused you to get involved in the field of mental health and experience.
Okay. All right. I've got I jumped through the hoops. I jumped through the educational hoops that they want you to jump through. I got a BA in psychology. I've got a master's degree in counseling. Got 2 years in a PhD program, a psychology PhD program. The whole time searching for answers. What is causing these mental illnesses? What's behind them? And I didn't find any answers. So it was really strange. I went through the 4 years at Temple University in psychology, looking for answers, and I found very few. And what I hated about psychology is they would write all these textbooks, and there was no way to check out anything that they were saying. You couldn't get into a psych hospital. You couldn't get onto a psych ward. You couldn't check any of this stuff out for yourself. It's like, here, take this and believe it. Yeah. And I wasn't very trustful of authority, even as a child. And I didn't like that. I was very suspicious of it. And I remember one time they, in abnormal psychology, the professor gave us a paper and it said, if two crazy people met and they had the same delusion. So if two people thought they were Justin Trudeau, two patients, one of them would have to give up that delusion and think of himself as somebody else. And even as a freshman, I'm like, why would that have to happen? I mean, why would one crazy person have to move aside because somebody else had his same delusion? So fast forward about 15 years when I was working at the biggest psychiatric hospital on the planet. There were 10,000 patients there when I got there. It was the size of a small city, Milledgeville, Georgia, Central State Hospital. It's now out of business, but it was the size of a small city at the time. I was doing rounds on the ward, and I saw a new guy. I could hear him arguing with his voices. So I tried to creep up behind him to see what he was saying, and he spotted me, and I asked him. I introduced myself. I'm Jerry. I'm the psych for this unit. Are you new? And he said, yeah, I got here a few days ago. And I said, what's your name? And he said, I'm Jesus Christ. And I remembered back to that freshman paper that I had to read. I looked him in the eye and I said, no, you can't be Jesus Christ because I am. And I stood there and I'm going, okay, what's he going to say? He thought about it for a while. He cocked his eyes up and he looked me in the eye and said, okay, we can both be Jesus Christ. And, walked off. So I'm like, what else did they lie to me about? What other fibs did they tell? So that increased my suspicion even worse. So I finished the BA at Temple University. I got a master's degree in counseling at the University of Georgia, and then finished 2 years in a PhD program, the whole time looking for answers. So after I finished my undergraduate degree, there wasn't anything. I guess the most useful stuff was experimental psychology, where you could go into a rat lab and you could run these patterns and actually watch the rats do what they predicted they would do. But otherwise, there was not a lot you could do to prove what they were saying. And the descriptions of the mental illnesses were basically descriptions. There wasn't anything there that talked about what caused those mental illnesses. And I'm like, well, okay, you got all these mental illnesses. Why? What causes them? Why are they there? What can you do about them? There wasn't hardly anything there except drugs. Give them drugs. Give them more drugs. What's going wrong with them in the first place? So I was searching for answers the whole time. Got up into the master's degree, and there were some answers. There was some of the basic counseling techniques, but really no deep-seated answer. And I kept thinking, well, they're hiding the answers in the next level. Maybe they have the answers in the master's degree. No. And then I'm going, well, maybe they just reserve them for the PhD programs. So I somehow got into one of the supposedly best PhD programs in the States, and I hated it. I absolutely hated it. There were no answers there. It was just, like they say, piled higher and deeper and more intense. So, I jumped through all the hoops.
What's the history of medicine in America? What's the history of this the condition of our mental health field? Where did it start? Where did disintegration start? I heard you mention early.
It started in 1910 with the Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefellers. They took over the medical, they took over medicine at that time. They paid off to Congress. They bought the votes, and they came up with something called the Flexner Report. Yeah. So what they did is they sent representatives to all the medical schools to see what they were teaching. Okay. And they were teaching all kinds of stuff. They didn't like that because they weren't making any money off of that. They weren't selling any drugs. Okay. So what they did is they went to Congress and they shut down any medical school teaching subjects outside of mainstream pharmacology. So you either teach pharmacology, drugs, or you get shut down. So all these other schools like naturopathy and the thing with the needles, acupuncture, electrical therapy, Tesla's violet ray, all those kind of things were now, relegated to the realm of foolishness or quackery. The only real medicine was pharmacology. And the edict was so powerful that only a few medical schools survived it, like Johns Hopkins and McGill and a handful of others connected with those groups. They were the only schools that could legally license doctors. And anybody who practiced outside of pharmacology or did something dual like naturopathy, and they were threatened. Their licenses were threatened. Everything else outside of pharmacology, was considered quackery, and it just went from there. They took over all the medical schools, and they still run them. It's like an insurrection.
It was an insurrection. I see a great awakening that began 30, 40 years ago. And I think it's picking up a lot of steam. And that's people saying, wait a minute, something's wrong here. I do see that people like you and I are finding each other with greater ease now because of the internet, because of social media. And I have a lot of hope for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Should everything remain, should the Republic remain as it has been. Hold together, yeah. I think there is a time of great exposure right now, and people are starting to connect the dots thanks to the pandemic and the last election and a number of things that have been transpiring in the last 15, 20 years. I do think people are waking up.
I think so, too.
Well, you've been in the mental health field for 40 years, and you've worked in more institutions than anybody I know.
Yeah, more than anybody I
So
know either. You know,
Yeah.
you know,
So I'd like you to give us a window, what you've seen develop and transpire in that period of time, because mental health is the number one health crisis we're facing in America today. And I won't get into the specifics of where we see the manifestation of this, but I think we're all recognizing that something's seriously wrong. So I wonder what your observations are.
well, let me tell you how seriously wrong they are. I mean, right now,
Who's they? Who's they?
the establishment, medical
Okay.
psychiatric establishment, right? Right now on the planet, there's more psychiatrists, there's more psychologists, there's more psychiatric drugs than at any other time in human history. And yet, the society is sicker than it has ever been. Our mental hospitals are overrun. Our prisons are overflowing with seriously mentally ill patients. They closed down all the state hospitals, starting with Proposition 19 in California, which was a tax rebellion. So they got the Californians got sick of these constantly increasing taxes, so the government closed down all the state hospitals, and then it swept the country. So then they went, oh, well, it's not good for these mental patients to be confined like this in these institutions with people taking care of them. It's better that they're out in the public and they're around more normal people. So these people were not taking these medications when they were in the hospitals because they're very toxic and they're very nasty. And they went, well, we're going to set up a series of mental health centers, all over the U.S. Now, a lot of these people weren't taking the meds when they were handed to them, especially schizophrenics, because they're very nasty meds. They're very toxic meds. They have a lot of side effects, and they turn the people into semi-zombies. They just don't want to take them. And so here they are expecting the sickest of the bunch to go out of their way and somehow find transportation that most of them don't have to go visit a mental health center and sit in a crowded lobby for hours waiting to see a psychiatrist who sees them for 15 minutes, gives them a prescription for more nasty drugs, and then sends them on their way. So right now, there's estimated to be 24 million schizophrenics worldwide, over 3 million in the U.S., and more coming every year. Then that their numbers are increasing. Since there is no treatment for them, or they won't participate in treatment, they end up stealing and robbing and selling drugs just to get by because they can't work a job. They can't concentrate. They can't think. They can't function. So they take them and they lock them up in the prisons. The prisons are overflowing with mental patients right now. They have taken the place of the state hospitals. And they say, oh, yeah, the prisons say, yeah, our mental health system functions according to community standards. What a lie. What a friggin' lie. I've seen it. I've watched what they do. They don't like paying for those expensive meds. So they only give them to people that are causing a massive number of problems. And these paranoid schizophrenics, they're paranoid. They don't call them paranoid schizophrenics for nothing. I mean, they're getting into all kinds of fights. They're stabbing people. The gangs are using them as hitmen. And I remember one time where they took one of the schizophrenics medications and started making him paranoid against another gang, saying, oh, that gang, there's a guy over there that wants to kill you. You better go kill him first. So they were using these guys like human torpedoes. I watched one time where, in order to cut down the funding, the chief psychologist put a stooge in the medical unit that would change the diagnosis of people like me were sending up there to be medicated, people we thought were dangerous. There was one time I said that there's one schizophrenic who was getting more and more unstable. He was threatening to stab another inmate, and he was getting worse and worse. So I sent him up there. I said, this guy needs to be medicated. He's psychotic. He's hearing voices telling him to kill another inmate. He's getting more and more agitated, more and more angry. I sent him there 3 times. This stooge changed his diagnosis 3 times from schizophrenia, paranoid schizophrenia, to a personality disorder, and sent him back to the unit. And each time I was documenting more and more and more. Like, okay, this guy's really getting dangerous now. This is what he's doing. I mean, the documentation was adding up. And then 3rd time he did that, they sent the guy back. he stabbed another inmate 21 times. All this just to save the drug money, to make the psychiatrist and the chief psychologist that were working together look good. And I was so mad. I was so furious. I didn't go to work for 2 days. I wanted to punch that guy in the face so bad I could feel it.
Yeah. The darkness of what's happening is palpable.
Yes.
And I think the secret is out. And I think people are recognizing that these psychotic disorders and these mental health conditions now, that something is spilling over into the masses like we've never seen. I just want to add a little comment about the medication, and I'd like you to comment and to see if I've misjudged what I've observed. And that is that part of the reason people don't want to take their meds is because the meds are the problem. They're not the solution. And it makes them feel so bad that they'd rather try to manage their condition on their own or in the streets than to feel half dead. Not to mention that many of the meds make them suicidal. I think the suicide rate increased in conjunction with the disbursement of the medications. Is that accurate or no?
Well, so the medications do have their place. There are some of these people, they're so
Right.
whacked out. They're so far gone. They can't be reached. The only thing you can do is, put them on medications. Now, these medications don't cure the problem. And one of the things that came up was,
Do you think we're over-medicating?
Yes.
I think that was my point. I think we're over-medicating.
yeah, we're over.
Why do you think we're over-medicating?
Well, because they don't see any other way to treat this stuff.
Yeah.
Now after studying paranoid schizophrenics for over 4 decades, it became increasingly clear to me that the cause of paranoid schizophrenia, and I'm just talking paranoid schizophrenia, these are the people who hear the voices, is not a biochemical imbalance. Those voices are entities. They speak in complete sentences. They run consistent, repeatable patterns. They're aware of what's going on around them. What they want to do is they're also parasites. They're energetic parasites. So they actually suck the energy out of the patient, but they have to turn their emotional state negative. So they can't create that themselves. So one of the number one patterns that I first saw with this was that the voices were consistently negative. They didn't ever say anything positive. They were negative, they were derogatory, they were insulting, they were abusive, they were destructive, they were self-sabotaging. They would tell these people every awful thing you could think of. You're no good, you're rotten, you're stupid, you're ugly, nobody likes you, your parents only pretending to like you, your girlfriend's cheating on you, your boyfriend, you name it. That's what they're putting into these people's heads. Okay?
It's interesting. I've worked with cancer for many, many years. If I could interject, and what you're saying so rings true. I've always said what cancer is to the body, parasites are to the soul of a man and a woman. And I saw the parallel between the destruction of cancer and the destruction of parasites to our organs. But these shadow people, as you sometimes, I think, refer to them as, or these entities, they're like people without bodies. They need consent. They need to occupy space by voluntary consent in many cases, or generational things. But they do occupy space, and they're destructive in the same ways. So thank you for saying that. I see that. I experience that. I've been speaking about that now for decades myself. I just didn't have your background to be able to be more bold about it. So I really appreciate that you're willing to come out and say what you just did.
Yeah, so they are energetic parasites. And, the first question that came to my mind when that pattern appeared was that what is it that holds them to that negative pattern? I mean, what stops them from becoming random? So the psychiatric mafia calls them auditory hallucinations. Hallucinations are all over the place. Some are positive, some are negative, some are neutral. They're just all over the place. You can't predict what a hallucination is going to do. These patterns of these voices are completely repeatable. Okay, they're completely observable by anybody who wants to observe them. So it took several years to come up with these patterns. Okay, and I'm like, what are these voices? What are? And I would ask all the people at these mental institution, the state hospital, when I first got there, what are these voices? What do they do? How do they work? They didn't know. They would say, well, they're just hallucinations. So they were brainwashed by the medical and educational institutions to believe that these voices were hallucinations, and that's all they were. They didn't make any sense. Nobody understood them. Nobody wanted to understand them because they were taught what they were. And if you already believe, you think you know what something is, you're not going to investigate it. It'll be, well, that's just how it is. That's how they are. None of those people, and there were hundreds of staff at this hospital. I mean, it was massive. It was the size of a small city. None of them were interested in what these voices were telling schizophrenics. Not a one. And I started asking them questions about what their voices were telling them. Now, it took me about a year to figure out how to speak to them because they don't call them paranoid schizophrenics for nothing. And our job was to monitor we had two jobs. One, I worked for the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation. So we were watching for patients, high-functioning patients, who we could train in a skill and get out of the hospital, remove them from the hospital. And the second thing, we were monitoring for patients who were getting out of control or starting to get out of control. And the only thing you could really do at that point was turn them into psychiatry, and psychiatry would drug them and increase their medications. Of course, they hated that. So we were actually spies for psychiatry. And they didn't trust us. When they start, there is no positive benefit for a schizophrenic to tell anybody about the voices they're hearing. Some of them at first think that everybody hears them. Then when they find out they don't, they're kind of shocked. And then when they tell their friends kind of back off away from them, move away from them. Then they tell their parents or their guardians, and they end up being hauled into a psychiatrist's office. They're told, what that reminds me of is that, what that sign, all those who go beyond here leave all hope behind. Psychiatrists tell them that it's a life sentence. If you're schizophrenic or you're paranoid schizophrenic, you got to be on these drugs for the rest of your life. There is no other alternative.
May I interject a question here?
Sure.
What is your experience with people who have not been labeled as paranoid schizophrenic, yet hear voices they know are intrusive voices, they know are not coming from them, and it's making them crazy to try to manage those voices because when they've tried to get help, the psychiatrists always, and now in some states, psychologists want to medicate them. What would you advise those people?
Well, after working in institutions virtually all my life, I didn't have access to a non-clinical population. Okay. So once I kind of retired from, all this institutional work, schizophrenics began writing me who were hearing voices. They were functioning. Some of them were taking meds, some of them weren't taking meds. But there's a lot of people out there who are hearing these voices and still functioning in different kind of jobs. Okay. And they're usually not real high-level jobs because the voices interfere with concentration. They interfere with thinking. Now, what the medications do. So these voices want to keep the patients upset. They want them feeling guilty, shameful, angry, anxious, every negative emotion you can think of. They want to stoke that because that's what they feed off of. Now, what the medications do, they're like major tranquilizers. They calm these people down. They have horrible, horrible side effects, but they actually calm them down. Now, the voices don't want them calmed down. Now, this is what we're facing with side effects, and this is just for one of them. This is for geodone. Skin rash, a feeling of restlessness, inability to sit still. So it's this constant agitation, constipation, dizziness, drowsiness, excessive saliva production, thick tongue, dry mouth, extrapyramidal disease. That's this extrapyramidal stuff. These drugs are slowly destroying their central nervous system.
That's right.
They're rotting it out. Now, they found this out with long-term patients in state hospitals who'd been taking these drugs for years. When they did the autopsy, their brains were shrunk like walnuts. So they went, we suspect that these antipsychotic drugs are doing this because these patients were treated virtually like all the others, but they were on antipsychotic drugs. Of course, Big Pharma and the psychiatric mafia jump up and go, oh, no, it's not our medications. It couldn't be them. It's the schizophrenia that's doing that. So here they try to push it off on, it's the disorder that's doing that. And, the people investigating this didn't buy it. So they started feeding these drugs to monkeys, mice, and rats and found out that their brains were being destroyed also.
That's right.
Okay? So these drugs with long-term use are toxic. They're poisonous. Some of these other side effects are generalized weakness, headache, nausea, weight gain, chest pain, heartburn, low potassium. And the patients are saying, I can't think, I can't feel, I'm a zombie.
Tell our listening audience firsthand a little bit about intrusive thoughts.
Well, if you write down how they behave, you go through this list of patterns. Well, I only hit the first one, so there's 23 of them here. Now you can get these patterns on my website at jerrymarzinsky.com. Okay. So these are like the operational definition of what psychiatry calls auditory hallucinations. Okay. These things, these entities are energetic. There is no space, there is no time, there is no matter in the universe they live in. So they can follow these schizophrenics no matter where they go. They can go from here to China and those voices will follow them. There is no time where they're at. Okay. Now, the second major pattern I found with these things was they're anti-religious. They don't like preachers. They don't like the Bible. They don't like the person going to church. They can't stand the 23rd Psalm. I remember when the patient came to me and said when he read the 23rd Psalm, his voices reacted like worms thrown on a hot frying pan. Okay. So what kind of hallucination would be anti-religious? Why would it consistently go against them going to church, reading the Bible, doing anything spiritual? And I actually did a little study on this once with some of the patients and asked them what happened when they went into church with the voices. And they told me that when the voices were very weak, when they went into a church, the voices shut up. If they were moderately strong, they would increase and get louder and try to drown out the preacher. In the meantime, they would be mocking the preacher, making fun of him, doing whatever they could to distract the person from listening to what the preacher had to say. And thirdly, if they were very strong, they would actually drive the person out of the church. I mean, the guy would just get up and run out. Okay. So second pattern. So when you're looking at these patterns, and like I said, there's 23 of them, these voices, you can't see them, you can't hear them, you can't feel them. I got to the point where I could feel them by the time I was done. It was an icky electrical feeling. But for all practical purposes, with the normal population, they don't exist. Okay. Now, the same thing would be true of a magnetic field. So if you get a very strong magnet, okay, you can't see that magnetic field. You can't feel it. You can't hear it. You can't smell it. You can't taste it. For all practical purposes, that magnetic field doesn't exist. Now, you get a jar full of iron filings and you put it on top of that magnetic field and you will see the outline of the magnetic field. That's what it looks like. That's what these patterns are. This is the outline or the patterns that these voices run, and they run them consistently. So if they're running consistent patterns, they cannot be hallucinations. Hallucinations are random. They're all over the place. So these voices foster and create negative emotion. They will tell whatever kind of lie, whatever kind of misconception. They will say whatever they need to say to upset the patient and make them paranoid and isolate them, okay, to create that negative emotional energy, because they can't create it on their own. They have to feed off of us. And then they energetically drain their victims. I don't know how many schizophrenics I spoke to who said, after the voices leave, I'm completely drained. I can't get out of bed. I can't even get up to eat breakfast. So I did a little study on that once with a 1 to 10, just a simple 1 to 10. How much energy do you feel you have before the voices come? How much energy do you feel after the voices come? It was statistically significant that after the voices attacked, these patients statistically felt less energy. So they were being drained. And I had some tell me, I can feel my energy leaving me when these things are attacking. And just quickly, they get louder after sunset. They get louder when ignored. Now, I've watched a bunch of psychiatrists say, oh, they're just hallucinations, just ignore them. I remember the first time I saw that, I called the patient back a week later because I was sitting in the psychiatrist's office with him. The psychiatrist increased his meds and said, you want just ignore the voices, they're just hallucinations. Called him back a week later. I asked him, how's that work for you? He said it didn't. They got louder. And it turns out that all the other patients that I talked to about this also, the voices got louder when ignored. You can't make them go away by ignoring them. They foster self-destructive behavior. These people self-sabotage. They're constantly shooting themselves in the foot. They foster isolation. They don't want these people to have relationships. They don't want them to be taken care of by their family. They want them isolated in a room by themselves, listening to the voices. And you talk to a lot of families and they say, well, Joe goes in his room, locks the door, and you could hear him talking to the voices. That's the worst thing that you could allow happen. They want to split up families. They want to split up marriages. They want to split up relationships. And they demand the attention of their victims. They're constantly maneuvering for increased control over their victims. They gaslight, they manipulate perception. They have complete access to the patient's memory. So they can go into the person's memory and pull up every rotten thing they ever did and start rubbing it in their face, okay? So they're energetic. They're energy. Thoughts are energy. Memory's energy. They can access that. They tell the patient not to tell anybody about them. They're consummate liars. You can't believe anything they say. They lie about everything. All they want to do is upset people. They steer the patient away from anything that fosters joy. They want them watching war movies and murder mysteries and reading, horrible books. They can manipulate feeling without speaking. They can short-circuit reason. Now, what's so dangerous about them, I found this out the hard way, was that they sound exactly like the thousands of other thoughts that go through a patient's mind on a particular day. There's no, we are the voices, or we are the archons, or there's none of that. It's the intent and the content that they put into the conscious stream, the consciousness stream of the victim. You're no good. You're rotten. That guy's he's mocking you. He's plotting against you. But it sounds just like all the other thoughts that go through your mind. And I remember patients telling me they would ask these voices, who are you? What are you? And the voices would respond, we are you. So they want the victim to think that their thoughts are also the thoughts of the victim, because we experience our thoughts in our head. We think that all thoughts that come into our minds belong to us. That's far from the truth. That's very far from the truth. Your mind's like a radio receiver. You're receiving thoughts from positive influences and negative influences. Swedenborg, the Christian mystic, says you're receiving thoughts from heaven and hell all the time. So it's like like the cartoons, you have an angel on one shoulder, you got a devil on the other shoulder. You're the one who decides which thoughts you're going to pay attention to.
And the mystery lies in the deception of destructive thoughts and helping people untangle and identify that, because sometimes they're not obvious. They're deceptive.
Oh, yeah.
They're manipulative.
Yep.
It's not always a frontal assault, is it? It's gradual.
No. No,
erosion.
it's gradual, and I've heard some of them start off by telling the patient, "Hey, go pick up a pen or go sit down," or it's like they got a new car that they're driving and they're testing it out to see what it would do and how well it will behave, and then it goes to where they start pushing and pushing and pushing, and what they're trying to do is remove the original personality and then take over. And once they take over, that person is no longer in control. The voices are in control. So I'm not going to go on and on with these patterns.
No, these are fantastic. If you don't mind, would you finish
okay.
the last few? There's 4 or 5 that I'd like to focus on, but if you could continue, that would be great.
Yeah, so one of the most dangerous is they pass themselves off as thoughts belonging to the victim. And they sound just like all the other thoughts that go through your head, except the intention is very different. And the content is very different. It's usually negative thoughts about the person or people around them or situations.
You know what's interesting about what you're saying? We've been married 43 years. We've raised 6 children, 5 living. We've raised 5 living children. And I remember at very specific times during their developmental years where I literally heard, saw, experienced things that made absolutely no sense. And there was a quiet, still voice saying, this is what's happening. This is what's happening. This is what you're up against. This is what you're really dealing with. And honestly, at the time, I wasn't working in the discipleship, counseling, and spiritual formation field like I am now. And I just graduated from UCI and I was getting into a hybrid master's PhD program in another school. So I was busy. I was distracted. But I have to tell you that there's a quiet, still voice that informed my conscience that something intrusive was happening outside of my knowledge. But because we were doing all the right things, loving our family, had a good relationship. Dad for sure worked a lot, and I was always reading and studying and everything, but we loved to cook and talk and be together. And for all intended purposes, we just had a great family. It was healthy. One day I remember leaving my house, looking back and saying, wow, this is as good as life can possibly be. Thinking that I just loved life. I loved my family. I loved my husband. Everything was wonderful.
They hate that.
They hate that. And those voices still, especially given the nature of my work and what I'm doing now, you woke me up to the fact that those things that I felt were intrusive thoughts and those warning voices of the highest calling of my conscience were in fact the battle between light and dark, good and evil, if you will, between opposing forces that at the end of the day want to disrupt my life, want to derail me, my husband, our children, and our marriage. So it's fascinating to hear you talk about this because inside of me, I'm saying, yes, yes, yes. And this battle, I think, this conflict, these voices are something that everybody with a pulse can identify with.
Yes. They'll make it very clear that it's not just schizophrenics that are being attacked by these things. We're all being attacked by these things all the time.
Yeah.
Sherry, the co-author of our book, she said that every negative thought you have is them. Every negative thought you have about yourself or anybody else comes from the dark side.
Yes, because we're hardwired to love.
Yeah, your spirit is positive.
Yes.
And I've watched them destroy relationship after relationship. They absolutely hate the 23rd Psalm. It's like punching them in the face. They can't stand it. I remember one patient telling me that his voices reacted to the 23rd Psalm like worms thrown on a hot frying pan. Now, what kind of hallucination would do that consistently?
Exactly.
So what I started doing was passing out the 23rd Psalm to these schizophrenic patients and saying, read this and tell me what happens. the voices reacted to them negatively consistently. They did not like the 23rd Psalm. They couldn't stand it. They also hate Psalm 91. But I think their most hated one is the 23rd.
Wow.
Now, why would a hallucination consistently react negatively to the 23rd Psalm?
Exactly.
Yeah, it makes no sense what the psychiatric mafia is doing. And they haven't studied these voices at all, ever. There's not one study that in existence that I could ever find about these voices because they consider them hallucinations, not worth studying.
That, and we are dealing basically with existential forces that we need to become more comfortable with speaking about, defining, explaining these shared experiences. And it's one of the things I love about your work is we're not going to find them in the halls of academia.
No.
We're going to have to start talking about some shared experiences that make no sense as people. We need to find words to give and language to explain what's happening, to displace the confusion, chaos, and dis-ease that's leading to the state of mental health that we all find ourselves in, battling, honestly.
Yeah, yeah. And you look at these patterns, and you look at what's coming across the mainstream media right now, they're almost identical. You know, this
Explain
garbage.
that. Explain that.
Well, you look at this, negativity. How much of the news is positive? 600,000 Ukrainians are dead in Ukraine now. For what? Yeah, and we're sending U.S. forces over there right now. And Russia's just steamrolling over the place. So the world's on the brink of nuclear disaster right now. It's insanity. Here's Macron over there with sending 2,000 supportive troops. I mean, what are they, teachers or something like that, advisors into Ukraine. They're going to get blasted to pieces. They already sent 7 of them home. They're already 7 dead already, and Russia will target the rest. And here's NATO trying to start a war by shooting rockets 1,500 kilometers into Russia to blow out one of their early warning systems that warned them of a nuclear attack. They're sending rockets to hit civilian populations in Russia. If that was happening here, there would be a hot war instantly. Putin has shown extreme patience. It's crazy what they're doing.
There's something happening that escapes reason that almost seems like insanity.
It is insanity.
Even to an onlooker that is saying, look, I'm not a person of faith, but something is not right here. The beautiful side of the darkness that's upon us, I think, is it's causing people to ask hard questions and to consider things that they otherwise would have discarded. Perhaps the reality that there are forces at play that are polarizing forces, that of life, that's usually compelled by our deepest convictions, and there's other forces that are more primal, if you will, that are informed by our instincts, right, to react, that inform our reactivities. And there's a battle between these things. One of them is an invitation to reason, something's wrong here. And I have everything within me to rise up and say, wait a minute, let's hit a hard pause here. But then there's this other thing that says, no, believe it because I said it and just do it. And it's something really dark. And people are becoming aware at least of that distinction. Exhibit A, the debate we just saw the other day. Don't believe what you see, believe what we're hearing. Regardless of which side of the fence you stand on, whether you're a conservative or a Republican, there's something dark that has descended upon us, and we're being told, do not believe what you just saw, believe what we're telling you.
Right.
Well, that's social engineering, and that's an imposition of insanity on the masses, because you're telling me to disregard what I see, what I hear, and what I feel. So there's a measure of insanity that is upon us, and it's being advanced by an agenda almost.
Yes, it is. And you look at the Yeah, you look at I think one of the big failures of the Christian church is to take into account the dark side. Jesus cast these entities out of, 23 people in the Bible? I think 23 times he cast these things out. And here's a Christian society that is just kind of downplaying, oh, yeah, there's a devil. And
they don't believe it.
They don't believe it. It's not real.
Well, you know why? Because they're not behind closed doors, and they haven't seen the disintegration of what you and I have seen and how blatantly obvious it has become. And now it's not just in the institutions that don't exist like they used to 20, 30, 40 years ago, but now it's happening in offices where doctors don't know how to do anything, practitioners don't know how to do anything, physical therapists. I have physical therapists calling me now and saying the state of unrest, confusion, and chaos is so consistent to some of the things you address that I don't know where to send them except, can you try to unwrap this and see what's behind their delusion, what's behind their torment, the confusion, chaos, and disease they're experiencing? But then honestly, Jerry, after listening to the debate, this isn't happening to us individually in our in our businesses, in our hospitals, in our mental health institutions, or in the classroom. Look what happened to us on national television, to the world. Literally, look at what happened. Something is seriously wrong.
Yes, and they're trying to paint a bright. Oh, they're trying to spin it.
There's no spinning deception. There's no spinning evil. There's no spinning darkness.
They've been doing it for they've been doing it for decades. But that last debate, I mean, it was
full display.
You could not miss it. You could not miss it.
No,
you'd have to be blind to not see that Biden is a geriatric case that can't function.
Right. But the question is, and this is the beautiful side of the evil that is upon all of us right now, is basically who's running the show here.
That's right. Who's
because
running
this was
the show?
Obvious to people like you and I. This was obvious 4 or 5 years ago. Okay, let's just call it what it is. Something wasn't right. But the question is, who's running the show? And this is where we have to have the strength, the courage to put, I think, all of our presuppositions in a margin, maybe on a piece of paper. Hold on to everything you know, you believe about space, time, matter, science, religion, everything. Put everything in a margin and hold on to your thoughts. But begin to take notes of what you're observing and see if they're consistent with reason. And if they're not consistent with reason and with the highest calling of your deepest convictions, you've got to say something's wrong with what I thought, I believed, and then move it off that page. And then some of the other presuppositions, if you say, okay, this is consistent, listening to a person like you, Jerry, right now, who's been at the pulse of mental health for 40 years, you're basically explaining to some extent what people are experiencing, and not in institutions, in their homes, in their place of business, in their families, with their children. And you're giving language to something, I think, that's touching all of our lives in one way or another.
Yes. And like I said, they don't just attack schizophrenics. That's where they're most obvious. But, who hasn't been walking down the sidewalk, minding their own business, or driving a car and going, I wonder what it would be like to drive into oncoming traffic, or standing on a bridge and going, what would happen if I jumped? I remember one of the most spiritual people I know, a preacher. He was standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon and had a voice barge into his head that said, jump. And I had a guy wrote me on my email. He said, oh, yeah, I know what you mean. I was standing behind my boss the other day, and this voice came into my head that said, spit on him, spit on the back of his head. He's going, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Wow. Well, I hope from this first segment that we just recorded, I hope people feel a little less crazy, a little more hopeful, and a lot more curious about the diagnoses they've received, the diagnoses they've given people, perhaps, and the situations they're dealing with. Jerry, thank you. I couldn't have done this without you. Thank you so much. By way of summary for this segment, Jerry, would you summarize what's happening with mental health right now and how serious the situation is and why we can have hope?
Well, like I said before, we've got more psychiatrists, more psychologists, more psychiatric medications on the planet than at any other time in human history. But yet the population is more and more mentally ill, and it's increasing every year. So the CDC reports that 132 people in the U.S. kill themselves every day. Suicide is the 11th leading cause of death in the U.S. In 2021, 48,000 Americans killed themselves, and it's increasing every year. Right now, it's up to 50,000 people who kill themselves. This is every year, year after year after year after year. 50,000 people died in the Vietnam War. 50,000 U.S. citizens. Okay, that's over a 10-year period, and this is happening year after year after year. And a good
because
number
the battle has come to us. That's what people aren't seeing. The war has come to us now, and we have to understand the rules of engagement. This is so important. Okay, continue. I'm sorry, I had to say that.
And despite a large number of those people being on antidepressant drugs and antipsychotic drugs and all kinds of other drugs, they kill themselves anyway. So those drugs aren't curing anything. They're not making anybody any better. Between 2000 and 2018, the suicide rates increased 37%. An estimated, from 2006 to 2016, the suicide rate increased by 2% a year, with 1.4 million suicide attempts in 2017 and 47,000 deaths. So 10,000 Americans are diagnosed with schizophrenic yearly. That's these entities taking them over. Okay, 10,000. All right. Among the top 10 health problems on the planet is schizophrenia. Okay. Now, what's the psychiatric mafia and medical? They don't want a cure for schizophrenia. Look at they've reduced
for mental health.
Right. They've reduced the funding for schizophrenia and mental health to a dribble. And they manipulated the statistics to make it look like they were investing more money searching for a solution. They're not looking for a solution. They don't care. They don't make money by curing people. They make money by endlessly treating psychiatric symptoms. So that's what they do. They treat the manifestation of the psychiatric illness. They treat the symptoms. They don't treat the cause. And the antidepressant market in the U.S. right now is expected to reach $15.98 billion. By 2023. Billion. We're not talking million. We're talking billion. The global antipsychotic sales hit 14.54 billion in 2021 and are expected to reach 15.5 billion by 2022.
Is that independent of the antidepressant?
Well, there were two different categories.
Antipsychotic. Yeah. And so we're talking about $32 billion industry.
Right.
Wow.
And that's what's driving these things. They say, oh, it's a chemical imbalance of the brain. Yeah, I remember time after time I'd go in with my patient with a psychiatrist, and they would. You would think if there was a chemical imbalance, they would have some kind of test to test for what's out of balance or by how much. If you have, low blood sugar or high blood sugar, they have a test. Where is it? Where is it in relation to norm? And I would go in there with these patients time after time, and never would a psychiatrist give any kind of test, any kind of objective test. EKG, EEG, and no lab tests, no blood work, no nothing to determine what chemicals in their brain were out of balance by how much. So this biochemical imbalance thing, and it turned out they don't have one. One does not exist. Matter of fact, they don't even know what the chemical balance of the brain should be. And this all started with a lie with Eli Lilly. In the 1980s, after the release of Prozac, they couldn't explain why it worked. So they just made up a reason. Eli Lilly advanced the chemical imbalance theory as a marketing scheme to sell their drug Prozac. There wasn't any demonstrable evidence showing that depressed patients had any imbalance, but Lilly ran with it. Before long, psychiatrists were telling patients that, depression and schizophrenia are due to a chemical imbalance in their brain. And they're still doing it, even though it has been disproven over and over and over again. There is no chemical imbalance. Before that, they were using genetics. They would say, oh, it's the genes. The genes are causing, but they couldn't identify a gene. And the people who were geneticists say, we don't see a schizophrenic gene. So here they come back again and go, well, it's not just one gene. It's hundreds of genes all mixed together and they all cause it. We haven't found it yet, but we will. And they're still pushing that in their advertisements right now. And it's a lie also. So it's lie after lie after lie. Their DSM, their directory of mental illnesses, all made up. There's not a single objective test to identify any of them. And every year they're making up more and more and more.
The exciting part of the times in which we're living, based on every single thing you're saying, is that in increased numbers, people are saying something is wrong. So the fact that you've identified these 28 patterns, or you're talking about these 28 patterns to help people take authority back, to help people reason, to help people think through these things, and you're giving these patterns and these voices a name, I think is the only way we're going to rise above conventional wisdom and expand the conversation beyond these traditional ways of dealing with mental illness. Really, we're seeing a massive destabilization of mental health, our mental health. And so we have to ask ourselves, wow, these patterns, for example, that Jerry is saying, are these afflicting me? I didn't even know there were these patterns, but 75% of what Jerry just talked about, it's afflicting me. And I'm really happy about what he just said, because there isn't a pill to fix this.
No.
So in the next segment, I want to talk about what people can do in the most practical ways. Stepping into rest, we're all about that. We're all about the integration of the spirit, soul, body. But I want to hear and that's how we help people get out of these places of confusion and chaos that derail their lives. But I want them to hear from you and what you see is an effective way to rise up and be encouraged by what's happening, because now pretty much everything's on the table for us to reason together and live free. So thank you, Jerry.
We hope listening to this episode has brought you closer to experiencing the freedom of wholeness and healing. If you have questions or comments about today's episode, or for updates about R.E.S.T, please visit our Instagram or Facebook at The Place of R.E.S.T. If you would like more information about Virginia, or to support and join the cause of R.E.S.T, please go to theplaceofrest.com/donate or call 949-289-5935. Thank you for listening to Rest with Virginia Dixon. We'll see you next week.